This is episode 5 of Baba Yaga's Magic, Slavic Ancestor Worship. Ancestor worship is huge in Slavic folk magic practices. We see the ancestors show up again and again in the old waves and the old beliefs. The power and presence of the ancestors really can't be overstated. But you may ask yourself, do I need a connection to my ancestors? Why would I want to cultivate that relationship? And if you do decide to bring your ancestors into your spiritual practice, how do you do it? Well, in this episode of Baba Yaga's Magic, we'll be discussing all of that. And I'll show you the specific ways that Slavic people connect to their ancestors and how you can create some beautiful ancestral magic. Before we jump into that, I have a quick announcement. I know everyone is watching celebrity news, who's taking who to court, who slapped who. I know those are all very, very important things, but I want to remind you that there is still a horrific invasion and genocide going on in Ukraine. Just because it isn't front page news every day doesn't mean that the atrocities have stopped. People are being forcibly starved. Civilians are being shot trying to escape from areas taken by Russians. And they're also being kidnapped and forcibly taken to Russia. Children are being separated from their parents. The list of the war crimes is horrific, and it goes on and on. So I have started a personal campaign that I am tagging "Do One Thing for Ukraine Every Day." I know that as this war in Ukraine goes on, we can feel overwhelmed, anxious, and helpless. And it may feel like you can't do anything to help Ukrainian families who just want to live their lives in peace, but you can. Global Giving has a Ukraine Crisis Relief Fund to provide humanitarian help to the people of Ukraine. Your donation to this fund will support Ukrainians in need with a focus on the most vulnerable, including children. So if you would like to participate in my fundraiser for Global Giving, all you have to do is go to ukrainianwitch.com, and that will take you directly to my Global Giving fundraising campaign. You can go to ukrainianwitch.com and make a donation. No donation is too small. You can give $1, you can give $5, you can give $100. I even had someone give $1,000. Amazing. So go ahead and give that, knowing that this is a very highly rated charity and that your dollars are going to go far and are going to help immensely for the Ukrainian people who are on the ground helping now. So you can go to ukrainianwitch.com and donate. You can go to my Instagram account, Madam Pamita, and go to the link in my bio and donate, or you can go directly to globalgiving.org and donate there. All of it goes to help Ukraine. You can do that. It's the easiest thing in the world to do, and you can help. And I hope you do help. All right, let's talk about ancestors. And my ancestral land is Ukraine, so that's why I'm super passionate about it. Let's talk about the ancestors. I want you to take a moment to think about your ancestors, whether you know who they are or don't know who they are, whether you had a great relationship to them or a more challenging relationship with them. You exist today because of the tenacity, the bravery, and the courage of the people who you call your ancestors. Human civilization really began about 10,000 years ago with the dawn of agriculture, give or take, a couple thousand years or so. Now, if we go back to that human civilization, you are the latest step in a ladder of generations stretching backward through time and history. And if we imagine each generation to be about 25 years in length, then we can see something absolutely beautiful that comes out of that understanding. Between that dawn of civilization and now, there have been just 400 generations. You have 400, I mean, you could say just, or they're the immensity of 400 generations. That you have 400 generations of human ancestors separating you from your first human ancestor. Well, how many ancestors does that give us? Well, if each of us is the offspring of two parents, and those two parents both had a biological mother and father, that means we have four grandparents. And each generation going back, we double that amount of ancestors. If we look back only 20 generations, which is about 400 years or so, 20 generations, not 400, we have each of us about 1 million ancestors. That's just in 20 generations. When we start to look at it and we go back further and further, we start to see that we share common ancestors with other people. Well, for sure, because we can't have billions and billions and quadrillions of people. That many people haven't existed. So we have this crossover and we realize that we're all related at some point. We go back far enough, we're all related. We all go back to those ancient ancestors in Africa when we go back to it, right? So we have millions and millions of ancestors that we are there for us, working with us, wanting to work with us, and wanting to be honored and respected by us. The roots of our folk magic practices, whether we're looking at Slavic folk magic practices or other folk magic practices, were really handed down from generation to generation through so many things, through music, through arts and crafts, through folk tales with encoded spiritual messages, through talismanic symbols, through folk practices, folk belief, and folk magic that are all with us today because our ancestors handed down these practices from parent or grandparent to child. Now, ancestor worship is such an important part of Slavic magic. The cult of the ancestors was a primary feature of the ancient pagan worldview of Ukrainian people and of many Slavic people. So many of the holidays that we celebrate in Ukrainian traditions commemorate the dead, and we're there to help the dead and respect the dead and honor the dead, but also to help the living. Ukraine was an agricultural society, primarily agricultural. And so we would honor our ancestors to help bless our harvest and to bless our planting and to bless that agricultural wheel of the year. In Ukrainian beliefs, the belief was that the reed or the family or the ancestral line was indivisible. It was a whole, and it consisted of that long thread that included not only the people who are alive now and the people who were to come, but also the people and the ancestors of the past. They were all seen as one continuum. And death was not seen as the ending of anything. It was viewed as perhaps maybe a departure or displacement in space. You weren't necessarily in the world of the living anymore, but it didn't disconnect the ties between you and your ancestors just because somebody passed away. Those connections were still strong and vital and alive, and the spirit of the ancestor was still alive. The ancestors were called in to participate in the affairs of daily life and in, of course, the agricultural work and the family as well. Ukrainian people and many Slavic cultural traditions include commemorative meals and feasts that were held throughout the year to remember the ancestors. And the ancestors were invited into these special ceremonies and holidays, and then they were let go at the end of the festive cycles. They were invited in, help join us, join our celebration, and then we bid them goodbye so that they could go back to the world of the spirits until we invited them for the next festive occasion. Commemorative feasts existed where we would summon an invitation ritual and we'd have a greeting ritual. Then we would have a communal ritual meal for the living and the dead. And then we would have a farewell ritual where we would bid the ones who had passed on goodbye until the next event that we would invite them to. Spirits were never seen as something spooky or scary in terms of our ancestral spirits. They were never seen as spooky and scary. They were always seen and imbued with warmth and love. You would invite them back with so much love and so much, it's like a cozy feeling. The spirits would come in and they would help us in our day-to-day life. But to have that closeness with your spirits, to have that connection to your spirits, you have to have that memory of them. You have to honor them and you have to invite them into your day-to-day life. Now, the belief existed in Slavic views of ancestral worship that spirits who have passed more recently the people that we had contact with when they were alive, we could call on them to help us with the mundane aspects of our life. More distant ancestors, the ones that we never met, the ones that we know nothing about, we can also ask them for gifts and offerings. They might not be so attached to our particular day to day life, but they can definitely bring us gifts. So, whether you know the name of your ancestors or they're so distant and the information is lost that you don't have that information, you can still invite them back into your life and honor them and connect to them. The view of ancestor worship in Slavic practices shows up in so many things. Like, this could be a whole book in and of itself. I mean, I talk about it all throughout my book, Baba Yaga's Book of Witchcraft. But really, ancestor worship is such a rich topic, and it's way more than can be fit into a single podcast. I mean, I think I may revisit it again at some point, but they really show up in so many practices. And we've heard about it already in some of the past podcast episodes, and it's going to show up again in other podcast episodes because it was pervasive. It really was. Ancestor worship was the pagan practice. For one, we could see ancestor worship show up in the element of fire. From about 3000 BCE, the ancient Trypillians, who were the ancient culture that existed from 5000 BCE to 2000 BCE, the ancient Trypillians practiced cremation. And so they saw fire as an entrance to the spirit world. Well, that practice carried over into ancestor worship that carried on. In the generations that followed, where our fires existed became a very respected place of the ancestors. The stove, the wood stove, that was a primary part of the ancient Slavic home, and probably the most important part. And if you live in a cold climate, having a fire in your home was essential to life. That wood stove, called the peach, was the home of the ancestors and a portal to the world of the spirits. Even today, that fire symbolizes lineage and family. So there's lots of spiritual practices in Slavic culture that reflect that. For one, there's the belief that you should never spit into a fire. If you spit into a fire, it was thought that you were spitting into the eyes of one's ancestors. That's a horrible thing. You wouldn't want to do that. It's disrespectful. So one would never spit into a fire. Not only that, but if you did spit into a fire, you might get punished by your ancestors who thought you were being rude and disrespectful, and they might give you blisters on your lips and your tongue. So you didn't want to have that for sure. So you would never spit into a fire. There's another old belief that goes along with this concept that the fire is the home of the ancestors. It was the idea that you should never poke at the fire with a poker to break up the embers to have them fall down through the grate. Because if you were doing that, it might cause your ancestors to fall into oblivion. They were at home in the fire. And so you wouldn't want to poke at that or spit at it or treat it disrespectfully. You wouldn't throw trash into the fire, for example. You would treat the fire with respect because the fire was the home of the ancestors and the connection to the ancestors. Now, there's another part of Slavic culture and Ukrainian culture that shows up where we honor our ancestors, not just the oven, not just the stove, and not just the fire, but the Pokut. The Pokut is the spiritual corner in the chata, the hut, right? The Pokut shows up in the East and in many homes in times past and in homes today. This is a sacred corner where someone would put the icona, the icon. They might have a picture of a saint. They might have a picture of Mary or Jesus or saint in that shelf in that corner. But prior to Christianity, the Pokut was the altar for the ancestors. And so this is an ancestor altar, an ancient ancestor altar. So saints and deities and pictures would be put in this area of the Pokut. But the Pokut goes back to the days when before these new gods and saints were brought to the people. Again, the ancient Trypillians, that Neolithic culture centered in what's now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, had home altars in the East that housed their deity figures. And the East is where the dawn breaks. And so it's sacred to our spiritual connection to the sun, which is also the sun and the light and our ancestors. It brings that energy in. In the oldest times, the east corner of the house was the place, as I mentioned, of the place to honor the ancestors. It was where the ancestor altar was placed and later became the altar for the saints and the deities. During different seasonal celebrations, we see the carrying over of this concept of the Pokut being the ancestor altar. We honor our ancestors at this on this Pokut by bringing wheat porridge called kutia, or crepes called mlinyets, or the fruit drink uzvar. And we would leave them for our ancestor spirits at this altar as well at different times of the year. We'll talk about that a little later in this podcast episode. Now, in the traditional Ukrainian home, the family meal would take place at a table that was positioned underneath this altar, which was another way of inviting the spirits of our loved ones to take a meal with us and to dine with us and to be with us every day and share in our special occasions, of course, when the holidays came. Now, the belief in the power of the Pokut is so ingrained that there is an old traditional oath that can never be broken. So if you are promising something, or if you are, saying that you will committing to something, you would say, I swear to you before the holy corner being the Pokut where this altar is. And this was to say that, to mean that you were saying that you were making a vow before not only one's deities, but one's ancestors. It's like, our English equivalent or American equivalent of saying, I swear on my mother's grave, right? I swear to you before the holy corner was the way of saying that. In the olden times, this area, this Pokut area, which was the ancient ancestor altar, was essential to every activity that was connected to lineage. So if you had something to do with your family line, the family to come or the family that passed, it was done at the Pokut. So newborn babies, for example, the first time they were given a bath and really brought into the family was done under the Pokut. A bride and a groom would sit at the table below the Pokut because that was like the ancestors being invited into that marriage. And in the old days, when anyone would go into a home, they would first take off their hat and bow to the peach, the fire, and bow to the Pokut, the altar, to sort of honor the ancestors, just like you would honor the elders in the home as you would come into the home. These places where the ancestors were considered holy places that you would honor the ancestors by nodding your head, bowing, taking off your hat, and so on. So you can, when you create a Pokut, if you ever create an ancestor altar in the eastern corner, you can also do that, taking off your hat if you're wearing one, or just nodding and acknowledging your ancestors when you come into the room. It's a beautiful way to honor your ancestors and make them part of your daily life. Now, the table, as I mentioned before, that was below the Pokut was a symbol of the unity of the household, which also included the unity of the ancestors as well. The table is so important in a traditional Ukrainian house. It's a place where we gather to share a meal, have meetings, resolve problems. And the table near the Pokut meant that you would be inviting your ancestors to witness those things, or to bless those things, or to offer their wisdom and guidance and protection to whatever work that you were doing at the table. So a Pokut would always traditionally have, that corner would have a table below it, the dining table. And so that would be a beautiful way to invite the ancestors into your daily life. That, of course, it brings up the idea of food. If we're talking about tables and kitchen tables and dining tables, we're talking about food, and food is so important in Slavic magic. I would say, to be honest, every meaningful interaction with our ancestors also involves offering them some food and drink. You have to make an offering to your spirits. This is definitely a hallmark of traditional Slavic pagan practices, is that there's a quid pro quo, there's an exchange of some kind. And so if you were going to work with your ancestors, you're going to honor your ancestors, you would bring them food and drink and so on. So we would set food and drink at the Pokut to connect to our loved ones who have passed on, and to help them on their way, to invite them and to celebrate with them. For example, bread, chleb, or bread, or kashanki, the dyed eggs at Easter time, those things might be put at the Pokut, but they also might be left at the grave sites of the ancestors to let them know how much we miss them and we haven't forgotten them. As I mentioned, bread, salt, kucha, which is a wheat and poppy seed porridge, uzvar, the boiled juice made from honey and dried fruit. All of these beautiful offerings would be left at the Pokut as an offering to our ancestor spirits. Traditionally, this is talking about that lineage. Children, the youngest ones, would be the ones who would offer the food to the ancestors. That was like connecting that family line from those who are the older generation to the living generation, to the new generation that's coming up. And it was a beautiful tradition to do that. Twice a year, there's some very special events that happen in traditional Ukrainian practices at the winter solstice, or what we would now look at as Christmas Eve, and at spring equinox or Providi, Easter time. A bowl kutya would be left at the altar, the family altar, the Pokut for the ancestors. And they would be left, that would be left overnight to feed the ancestors and allow the spirits to join in the dinner, feel honored, and feel welcome. Now, there'd be a little divination as part of this ritual. Everyone would take their spoon and leave it on the table. All the living people would leave their spoon on the table. And if someone's spoon was turned over, upside down, face down, it was a sign that that person would join the spirits within a year. So it was a sign from the spirits that that person would be going. So you'd have that, you'd know you had that limited time with your loved one and you needed to make the most of it. Kutya as an offering, that porridge, that special porridge that we give to our ancestors, was also eaten by people, living people, of course, on the holidays. And it was also offered at the Pokut to loved ones 40 days after their passing as a meal to celebrate their initiation into the world of the spirits. So Kutya was very much associated with ancestors, ancestor worship, and helping people and spirits pass into that initiation into the world of spirits. Now, there's special holidays, of course, in Slavic magic that are associated with this ancestor worship. In Ukraine, we have a holiday called Providi, which happens a week after Easter. It happens different days in different regions and different areas, but generally it happens the week after Easter, the Sunday after Easter. I just was back in Philadelphia at my Ukrainian relatives at their cemetery, the Ukrainian cemetery in Philadelphia, to do Providi because I hadn't done it before. I hadn't traveled back specifically for that, and I wanted to go and do that. So for Providi, memorial services for the deceased were held in that week immediately after Easter. And my cemetery where my ancestors are buried, it happens a Sunday after Easter. Now, this practice is not just Ukrainian. It has a different name in different cultures. So in Russian, it's in Russia, it's Radonitsa. It's sometimes called Radonika or Radonitsi, but it's mostly called Radonitsa. In Kievan Rus, which is the old ancient Ukrainian culture, the local name for it was Krasnaya Gorka, which means beautiful hill, has that same meaning that you're going back. Radonitsa means day of rejoicing. Providi means farewell, like giving them a beautiful farewell. In Serbia, the day is called Pobusani now again, I don't speak Serbian, so bear with me here. Pobusani Ponedjeljak, which means the tomb sweeping Monday. And Podjeljak is the more archaic form of the modern Serbian Ponedeljak, which is the more modern word. So this is the time when you would go to the graves, you would clean up the graves, you'd have a little picnic, you would celebrate with your ancestors, hang out with them. There might be music, there might be dancing, there's laughing, there's good times, you're talking with your ancestors. It's a positive holiday. It's not, oh my goodness, my cat just walked in front of the microphone. It's not a holiday of sadness, it's a holiday of joy and connecting to your ancestors. The ancient Western Slavs also celebrated a similar holiday called Forefathers' Eve, and in Polish it's Dziady, and in Belarus it's the same Dziady, and that would fall in fall and spring. They'd have those times when you would go to celebrate with the ancestors at the cemetery. And the fall one in the Polish autumnal feast, the spring one is Dziady, and the fall one is Zaduski. So these were held on the Sunday or Monday following Easter, and then there's a fall one, Zaduski. And sometimes they were held on Holy Thursday. In Bukovina, in Ukraine, they're sometimes on Saturday. In Galicia, it's on Friday or Saturday following Easter. I mean, every local region had their day that they did it, but it always seemed to follow Easter, which was the old traditional, of course, celebration of spring equinox. What happens at these things, as I mentioned before, people bring Easter eggs, they bring bread, they bring bowls of food, they bring liquor or wine. They have a little commemoration service. I saw it when I was at the Philadelphia cemetery, where they have the priests come and they do a blessing of the graves. And then you would go and have a little picnic. You'd leave some food and drink for your dead relatives. And you might have some games or dancing, hanging out. It was a positive, happy time that you would spend with your ancestors. Um, in Ukraine, we also have another time that we really invite our ancestors, which is Christmas Eve. And that is closely associated with that family lineage belief and the commemoration of the dead. And we would also bring those foods and offer them at the Pokut, as I mentioned before. In springtime, the dead are remembered on St. Theodore's Day, which is the first Saturday of Lent. The sending off of Providi, which I mentioned, which is after Easter. And also during the days of Pentecost. I mean, there's all these celebrations in the fall. There's St. Demetrius Day, St. Cosmos Day, and St. Michael's Day, all the days that we would celebrate with our ancestors. So there's plenty of celebrations that happen and all these special holidays. Now, this isn't the only way that we can connect to our ancestors. We have, as I mentioned in episode 2 of Baba Yaga's Magic, I talked about the Domovic, and the Domovic is a house spirit, but a Domovic is your ancestral house spirit. He's tied to your ancestors by his connection to fire, right? So we know there's that connection of the ancestral and the fire, right? And so the fire of the peach, which is the spirit of the ancestors, is also the place where the Domovic lives, and he's the guardian of the spirit of the fire, the spirit of the hearth. As I mentioned in that episode, he can bear a family resemblance and can look like a tiny version of a strong and positive male ancestor of yours. He might be dressed in like the typical peasant outfit from the old country with embroidered vyshyvanka and loose pants and a belt wrapped around his waist. And so this is a representation of your ancestors that you invite in your home. So when you invite that Domovic in your home, you're not just inviting a random house spirit, you're inviting your ancestors into your home. And you can develop a relationship with your Domovic to connect to the spirit world and to your ancestors. Another way that you can connect to the ancestors is through the rhodorisha, any of the sort of liminal spaces. So liminal spaces are really prevalent in Slavic magic, and we're going to talk about that in a later episode of this podcast. Liminal spaces are places that are magic because there's not one place or another. It's like in between. And when you're in between, you're more open to magic and the world of spirits. So one of those places is the rhodorisha, which is the crossroads. So the rhodorisha is in Slavic magic a place where you can meet spirits and you can meet your ancestors. So you go alone at midnight to a crossroads, which is a path where two roads meet, right? And you can sit there, find a comfortable place to sit and wait, and then you might meet one of your ancestors. So that's a way if you wanted to meet one of the spirits. It's risky, but it's very rewarding to do. The D-Duk. The D-Duk is the sacred sheaf of wheat that is placed on the home altar, and the D-Duk itself translates to grandfather spirit, and it's a blessed sheaf of wheat that houses the spirits of our ancestors over the winter holidays. It's placed at the Pokut. It's a house for them, and it's a way for us to acknowledge our ancestors during the sacred winter holidays. It gives a temporary home for them to visit, and it also connects them to the agricultural work that we do, the spiritual agricultural work that we do to bring blessings into our home for the coming year. Now, Mother Earth is another way that we can connect to our ancestors. Now, we think about this. They had the Slavs and Ukrainians in particular have a deep connection to the land. Why? The land is what provides food, right? And the land is the soil that is like our native soil and super powerful and positive in ancestral magic and magic in general. We can have a deep connection to the ancestors through the earth, in particular, the earth where our ancestors come from. The Cossacks, the Kozaki were said to carry a pouch of their native soil wherever they went. They went traveling around. They were warriors, and so they traveled to wherever they needed to travel, but they would bring a pouch of their native soil wherever they went to ensure their safety and keep them connected to their ancestors. That way, in their warrior life, if they would die in a distant land, that clod of their family earth, their familiar earth, family, familiar meaning family, right, would connect them to the land of their ancestors wherever they were buried. Also, if they were in distress, they could take that pouch and touch the earth in it or even kiss it to show their love for their ancestors and show their love for their Mother Earth and ask her for help. If they moved and had to stay in a foreign land, they could take that pouch of earth and pour out that pouch of earth from the pouch and step on it barefoot and say, I walk on my land. And that way, the new land would become their own ancestral land. So, a way that you can connect to your ancestors is by carrying a clod of earth from your own home or your ancestral home. You can wear it in a little leather pouch around your neck, or you can attach a sack of it to your belt or carry it in a cloth or handkerchief placed in your purse or your luggage for protection when you're traveling away from home. It's a beautiful way to connect to the ancestors. There's another thing in Slavic magic called ancestor water. So, rainwater collected at dawn or dusk can be used to connect with the ancestors. It's called water of the ancestors, and it's used to obtain their advice, to protect your property, and to help people who are passing into spirit so that they can either return to the world of the living or pass easily. So if you have someone who may go either way, you can use this water, this ancestor water, to help them to heal or to help them to pass easily into spirit. Ancestor water also can be used to remove curses or jinxes. It's a really beautiful way to connect to your ancestors and help them help you in this lifetime, in this world that we of the living that we exist in right now. Now, in a minute, I'm going to tell you some more ways that you can connect more deeply to your ancestors. But if you'd like to learn more about Slavic magic, I invite you to check out my book, Baba Yaga's Book of Witchcraft. Baba Yaga's Book of Witchcraft is an exciting book of ancient Slavic magical practices. In this book, you'll sit at Baba Yaga's side and listen to her stories about the birth of the sun, the land of the blessed ones, and the spirits that live right beside us. More importantly, you'll learn the secrets of her magic, the crafts, the talismans, the inscriptions, the incantations, and the rituals that will allow you to not only learn about the ancestors, but to discover your own Baba Yaga within. It is available now, and the first printing is sold out. They've already moved into the second printing. So if you'd like to get your first printing copy, which is always the more valuable copy, you might want to get on it because soon the first printings are going to be gone. So you can order yours from the usual places: indiebound.org, bookshop.org, barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com, or you can order a signed copy from me at parlorofwonders.com. Or you can call up your local bookshop or metaphysical store and ask them to order it for you. That is always a helpful thing to do because if they order it for you, they usually order some copies for the store and it benefits everyone. So it's a really, really good way to sort of make your dollars do more because you're helping that little mom and pop store. And I really think they appreciate it. I know they appreciate it. And I appreciate you making that little extra effort. So let's talk more about the ways that you can connect to your ancestors. So you can create Slavic talismans representing the ancestors. So one of the ways you can do that is through vishivka, which is embroidery. There are two specific embroidery symbols that are important for ancestral magic. One is kalina. So if you've heard the song that's all over the place right now, Oyu Luzi Chervono Kalina, that's the in the field of the Gilder rose. The Kalina is the Gilder rose, which is representational and important for ancestry, especially for Ukrainians. It's a bush that produces little ripe red berries, little tart berries that can be used in jams and so forth. And they're kind of like cranberries, they're little tart, but they can be sweetened up and made really nice. And the kalina represents the blessing of the ancestors and is a symbol of the ancestral lands for Ukrainians. So it's really important. Mak or puppy is also a symbol for remembrance of the ancestors. So you can embroider that kalina or that poppy symbol as a way to tap into that ancestral connection and honor your ancestors and honor your lineage. Poppies, are interesting because poppy seeds are also a powerfully protective talisman that can reverse negativity and protect against evil. And they are often included in offerings for the ancestor spirits, like kutia, that porridge. We add poppy seeds to it to connect it to the ancestors. So you can embroider these designs into your talismans, onto your clothing, into a little charm that you make, and bring that ancestral magic into your practice. And you want to find some patterns for these designs. You can find them in Baba Yaga's Book of Witchcraft in chapter 1. Now, the Motonka, the spirit doll, is another way that you can connect to the ancestor spirits. The Motonka is a doll, a spirit doll, that is a homemade puppet that is meant to be a house for the ancestors so that they can be invited into your home to protect and bless your family. A motonka is made by winding and wrapping cloth. We don't use needles. We don't sew it. We just wind and wrap. So they don't have faces because a face would capture a spirit, and we don't want to capture our ancestor spirits in it. We just want them to be able to come in to do their work and be able to leave freely. So these very specific special dolls are really important in Slavic ancestor magic. They are the house for our ancestors, and you can also find out about them in chapter 2 of Baba Yaga's Book of Witchcraft. You can make an ancestor altar or an altar to your Domovic, who is also your ancestor, and you can leave foods out for them. You can leave poppy seeds, bread, kutia, mushrooms. These are all connected to the ancestors. Mushrooms are one of the very special foods that are connected to the ancestors because mushrooms are kind of liminal, right? They traverse between the worlds. They're not quite a plant. They're not quite an animal. They're somewhere in between. And they're used for medicine and healing by wise women. And they're featured in dishes that are shared with the ancestors and served at these memorial holiday dinners that we serve for them. The winter solstice meatless meal that is shared with the ancestors includes mushrooms as one of the dishes. So this is a great example about using that and foods that are appropriate for offerings for your ancestors. You can also visit their graves at one of those special holidays or any time and have a picnic with them. As I mentioned earlier, in Providi, we make some traditional foods and leave those. We have a picnic and leave some food and wine and or spirits with the spirits and offer them as a gift. But you could also do things like play an instrument or sing for your ancestors or have a conversation with them. Leave some beautiful flowers. Paint some beautiful talismanic eggs. You can do all of these things to help and connect to your ancestors, and that's another beautiful way to do that. Lastly, another way, second to lastly, you can work with bones. So in the most ancient times, when the dead were buried, there was a custom called double sepulcher. Double sepulcher meant that you were burying your ancestors twice. So after they had been buried for several years, you would take the bones of the loved ones out of the grave, wash those bones, and place them in the Pokut as a way to invite our beloved ancestors back into their special sacred place of the home. Then they would be reburied again and rearranged. Those bones would be arranged in a certain way. This practice was an ancient practice, and obviously it isn't happening now, but we involve those bones in our practice because the bones represent that the ancestor still exists, that spirit still exists. So you might want to take something that represents bones and the bones of your ancestors, such as you could take animal bones, or you might have a skull statue or a skull candle or something like that, and use them at your home altar to remind you of your ancestors and the ones who have passed on. You can also bring in a D-Duk. That's that winter solstice celebration. The Ukrainians bring in and invite their ancestors by creating a D-Duk, which is a sheaf of wheat. The ceremonial sheaf of grains is a symbolic sacrifice of the best of the harvest and symbolizes that circle of life, death, and rebirth that our lineage also shows us, right? The cycle of the seasons, the rebirth of the sun, all of those cycles that are so important in our pagan practice. So when we create a D-Duk, we invite the ancestors and their spirits into our home for their blessings of health, wealth, fertility, peace. As I mentioned before, D-Duk means grandfather spirit and represents that idea that when we create this beautiful artifact, we invite all of our beloved ancestors to join us for our holiday celebration. So if you would like to know more about a D-Duk, I am doing on December 4th, I'll be teaching a class on how to make a D-Duk and other winter solstice magical rituals in the Slavic tradition. And you can sign up now by going to witchcraftworkshops.com and looking for the December 4th Witchcraft Workshop. Okay, so now we know why and how we can connect to our ancestors. But the real reason we need to connect to our ancestors is because they can become great protectors to us. Those spirits love us and care about us. The ancestors are who got you to where you are today. A little bit of your ancestors lives in you right now. So no matter what they were in real life, I mean, they had their, issues perhaps in real life. In spirit, they are in their purest, most positive form, and they are able to indulge us with that pure love. And all they ask for you in return is that you do not forget them. Remembering them gives them energy to help and assist you. So I would invite you to remember your ancestors, honor them, and give them life again by doing these beautiful practices. Well, that about does it for this episode of Baba Yaga's Magic. If you would like to get even more info about Slavic magic, then check out the Learn page over at the Parlor of Wonders, where you will find a ton of resources, including workshops, blog articles, past podcast episodes, and the way to join me over Zoom live for the Magic Q&A Tea Party. It happens every Sunday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Mountain, 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern. Just go to parlorofwonders.com, click on the Learn tab, and you'll see all the goodies there. I want to say thank you to all the Spell Squad members out there who have subscribed to and shared this podcast with your friends. You are amazing and awesome, and I thank you so much. I want to say thank you to the fabulous folks who have left reviews on iTunes and Stitcher and all the places that you can leave reviews. Those reviews really help get the word out to the wider world about the podcast, and I appreciate you taking the time to do them. I want to say thank you to Gilles Navarre for production and engineering, and thank you to you for joining me. I'm looking forward to our next episode when we'll be learning about the Rusalki, Slavic water spirits. Until next time, this is Madame Pamita and Baba Yaga saying Za Mahiu to magic, and may all your stories have the happiest fairy tale endings.